In 1984, in the coalfields of Siberia, Soviet engineers did something that sounds like a fairy tale. They tore up a railway line. They shut down a stretch of the power grid. They cleared a path across the open steppe, several kilometers long. Not for an army, not for a rocket, not because of any disaster. They did it so that a building could cross the ground. A building that weighed over 10,000 tons. And walked. It was the largest excavator the Soviet Union ever built. An arm 100 meters long. A bucket big enough to swallow a mining truck whole. 10,000 tons of steel that moved, one slow step at a time, on its own 2 feet. It dug for 15 years. It never broke down. It never failed. And then it died anyway. Not because it wore out. Not because something snapped. It died because the country that built it simply ceased to exist and left 10,000 tons of walking steel standing alone in the snow, with no one left to own it. This is the story of the walking giant of Nazarovo, how a nation taught a machine the size of a cathedral to walk, and how that same nation left it to be torn apart for the copper inside its veins. Chapter 1. The Empire of the Open Pit. To understand why the Soviet Union built the biggest digging machine on Earth, you have to understand what it was digging for. For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union ran on coal. Coal heated the cities, coal fed the power stations, coal drove the furnaces that made the steel that built everything else. And the cheapest coal in the world is the coal you can reach from above, not deep underground in tunnels, but in a vast open pit carved down into the earth from the surface. But open-pit coal comes with a problem. The coal seam lies buried under a thick blanket of rock and soil. The miners call it the overburden, the dead weight of ground sitting on top of everything you actually want. And before you can take out a single ton of coal, you have to move all of it. Millions upon millions of tons of barren earth, lifted, swung aside, and dumped out of the way. Now, there is a slow way to do this, and there is a Soviet way. The slow way is to dig up the overburden, load it onto trucks or trains, and haul it somewhere else. Fleets of vehicles, rivers of fuel, armies of drivers. The Soviet planners hated that. It was expensive, and it was endless. So they reached for a different idea, an idea with a beautifully blunt Soviet name: transportless mining. Instead of hauling the overburden away, you bring in a single colossal machine. It sits at the very edge of the pit. It reaches out with an enormous arm, scoops up the dead earth, swings around, and drops it straight into the empty space where the coal has already been dug out. No trucks, no trains, no fuel. The machine is the entire operation, all by itself. And here is the logic that led, step by step, to a monster. The bigger the machine, the longer its arm. The longer its arm, the deeper the pit it can uncover in a single pass, and the further it can throw the waste. A bigger machine means a deeper mine, a wider mine, more coal, more cheaply. In a planned economy that measured success in raw tonnage, there was only ever one direction to go. Bigger. Always bigger. This was the age of Soviet gigantism, the deep belief that the biggest machine was, by definition, the most advanced machine, and the truest proof that the Soviet system could outbuild the West. The tallest, the heaviest, the most powerful. A country that could put a machine like that in the ground was a country that had arrived. And in the coal basin of Nazarovo, deep in the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia, that belief took physical form. They would build a single machine, a one-off, the only one of its kind, and it would be the largest walking excavator the world had ever seen. They would call it simply by its size. 100 by 100, a 100 cubic meter bucket on a 100-meter arm. But to build a machine that big, the Soviet Union first had to solve a problem that had haunted these giants from the very beginning. A machine that heavy cannot simply drive. it has to learn to walk. Chapter 2. The Man Who Taught Machines to Walk. Here is a question that sounds simple, and is not. Why does a giant excavator walk instead of rolling on wheels, or crawling on tracks like a tank? The answer is weight. Picture 10,000 tons of steel. If you put that much weight on wheels or on ordinary tracks, the ground beneath simply gives way. The machine sinks into the soft, dug-up earth like a boot into wet mud, and it buries itself. The secret to holding up a giant is to spread its weight over the widest possible area, to press down as gently as you can. So a walking excavator does something clever. When it is digging, it rests its whole enormous body on a single vast round base plate, a steel disc more than 20 meters across. The writer at one magazine described it perfectly. It sits, like a penguin, on its belly. All that weight, spread out across that great round foot, presses on the ground more gently than you might believe for a machine the size of an apartment block. But a machine resting on its belly cannot move. So how do you make it walk? On either side of the body sit two gigantic shoes. The Russians called them skis. To take a single step, hydraulic rams press those shoes down against the ground and lift the entire body, all 10,000 tons of it, just clear of the base plate. With its weight now on the shoes, the machine heaves itself backward a few meters, settles its body down onto the plate again, lifts the shoes, and reaches them forward for the next step. And then it does it again. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that. This machine does not roll. It does not glide. It heaves, slowly, deliberately, the way a person drags a wardrobe across a room, one enormous shove at a time. And it walks backward, retreating along the edge of the pit as it eats away the ground in front of it. Its top speed is measured in tens of meters per hour. Now, the idea of a walking machine was not born in the Soviet Union. In the West, engineers had built walking draglines for decades, using a heavy mechanical linkage, a great turning cam and beam that lifted and shoved the machine along. It worked, but it was complex and heavy, and it fought you as the machines grew larger. And that mattered more than it might sound. Every extra 1,000 tons you ask a machine to lift with each step means bigger shafts, heavier linkages, more moving iron grinding against more moving iron. The mechanical walking gear could be scaled up, but only so far before the mechanism to move the giant became a giant problem all by itself. There was a ceiling built into the design, and the Soviet planners wanted to build straight through it. The Soviet breakthrough was to make the machine walk on hydraulics, on fluid and pressure, instead of iron linkages. As the story is told, the idea came to a Soviet engineer from watching a burst fire hydrant in the street, a sudden, effortless surge of water under pressure, doing in an instant what heavy machinery struggled to do. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, the principle was real, and it was powerful. Hydraulics were lighter, simpler, and crucially, they could be scaled up almost without limit. Which is exactly why the Soviet Union, and not the West, would push this idea to a 10,000-ton extreme. And behind that push stood one man. His name was Boris Satovsky. He had started his life in machines from the bottom. As a young excavator operator, sitting in the cab, working the levers himself. He joined the great Uralmash works, the heavy machinery plant in the Urals, and he rose to become its chief designer of mining machines. And in the years after the war, on a brutal government deadline, it was Satovsky's team that built the first true Soviet walking excavator. He was, quite literally, the man who taught Soviet machines to walk. For decades he made them bigger and bigger and bigger. And the 100 by 100, the walking colossus of Nazarovo, would be the last and greatest of them all, the crowning giant at the very end of his career. the masterpiece of the man who started out working the levers himself. But designing a machine that big was only half the battle. Now they had to actually build it and somehow get it to the middle of Siberia. Chapter 3. 20 trains to Nazarovo. You cannot deliver a machine like this. It is too big to drive, too big to tow, far too big to load onto anything and carry. The bucket alone was larger than any railway wagon in the country. So the 100-by-100 could not be transported at all. It had to be grown. The machine was built at the Uralmash works as a colossal kit of parts. Beams, plates, castings, motors, the great ring it would rotate upon, and then all of it, the entire disassembled giant, was loaded piece by piece onto the railways. By the accounts that survive, it took around 20 full trainloads to carry one excavator across the Soviet Union to the coalfields of Krasnoyarsk. 20 trains for one machine. And when all those parts arrived at Nazarovo, there was no factory to assemble them in. There was only the open pit and the Siberian sky. So they built it where it would work, on the very edge of the mine, out in the open, raising the 100-metre arm and the towering body against the horizon. A machine the size of a building, assembled outdoors, like a cathedral rising on a plain. And the engineering that went into it was punishing. Remember where this machine had to live: central Siberia. In winter, the temperature falls toward -40 and below. And at those temperatures, ordinary steel betrays you. It grows brittle. It can crack under a load it would shrug off in summer. A machine that flexes 10,000 tons of steel with every single step cannot afford brittle metal. So it was built from special cold-resistant steel, designed to stay tough in a cold that would shatter lesser machines. And then there was the power. The 100-by-100 carried no engine of its own, not one. It was fed from the outside, plugged into the power grid by heavy, high-voltage cable, drinking electricity straight from the Soviet network to drive its 4 great motors. It did not carry its strength inside it. It was wired into the country itself, like a limb of the state. And that image is worth holding on to. Because a machine with no engine of its own, a machine that lives only as long as the grid feeds it, a machine wired directly into the body of the Soviet Union, is a machine whose fate is tied, utterly, to the fate of that country. When the country was strong, the giant was strong. And when the country fell, but that was still years away. For now, in the late 1970s, the assembly was finished. The cables were live. The great arms swung out over the pit for the first time, and the largest excavator on Earth went to work. Chapter 4. The 11-Kilometre Walk. For a few years, the giant did its work in one place, chewing through the overburden at the edge of its corner of the mine. But a coal mine is not still. It moves. The face where the digging happens shifts across the landscape year after year as the coal is stripped away. And eventually, the work moved to a whole different section of the mine, which meant the giant had to move too. In 1984, the 100-by-100 had to relocate to the Chulimsky section of the Nazarovo field, a journey of about 11.5 kilometers. Now stop and think about what that means for a machine like this. It cannot be taken apart and shipped. That would take months and 20 trains again. It cannot be lifted. It cannot be carried. There is only one way for the 100-by-100 to travel 11.5 kilometers. It has to walk the whole way, on its own 2 feet, at tens of meters per hour. And a machine that big, moving that slowly, cannot go around anything. It cannot steer around a railway line. It cannot duck under a power cable. It cannot wait at a crossing. So the Soviet engineers did the only thing they could. They did not move the machine around the obstacles. They removed the obstacles from in front of the machine. Railway lines that lay across its path were pulled up out of the ground, dismantled, so the giant could step over where they had been, and then, in some cases, laid down again behind it. High-voltage power lines had to be specially prepared so the towering machine could pass beneath them without tearing them down. The landscape itself was taken apart to let the building through. Picture the scene. A machine the size of a cathedral, 10,000 tons of steel crossing the open Siberian steppe at walking pace, slower than walking pace, while ahead of it, crews tear up railways and rewire the power grid, and behind it, they put the world back together. A slow, grinding, deliberate procession, measured not in miles per hour, but in meters, as civilization rearranged itself around a single, enormous, walking step. It took the giant a long, patient march to cross those 11.5 kilometers. And when it arrived at the Chu-Limsky section, it set its great round foot down onto the earth, swung out its 100-metre arm, and went back to work, as if nothing had happened. It is one of the most extraordinary things any machine has ever done. Not the fastest, not the most violent, but there is something almost dreamlike about a building that stands up and walks across Siberia, one step at a time. The Soviet Union had built a machine that moved like a living thing. Chapter 5. 15 Good Years. For about 15 years, the walking giant of Nazarovo simply did its job, and it did it superbly. Day after day, year after year, the great arms swung out over the pit. The bucket, 100 cubic meters, big enough to swallow a mining truck, bit into the overburden, dragged back a mountain of earth, lifted, swung, and dumped it into the void behind. And then again, and again, tens of thousands of times. The numbers it moved are hard to hold in the mind. By the records that survive, across its working life, the machine shifted something like 127 million cubic meters of earth. Not tons, cubic meters. Enough barren ground to bury a small city. Moved, one bucket at a time, by a single machine. And what the giant made possible was cheap coal in enormous quantity. In 1982, the Nazarovo mine set a record. More than 15 million tons of coal pulled from the ground in a single year. Now, to be clear, the 100 by 100 did not dig that coal itself. It is a stripping machine. It clears the dead earth off the top. But it was the giant that made the record possible. It cleared the way. Everything else followed through the gap it opened. And behind the numbers was a small crew of people who ran this thing. Imagine that job. Climbing up into the body of a machine the size of a building, high above the floor of the pit, sitting at the controls of the largest excavator on the planet, and feeling that 100-metre arm answer to your hands. Feeling the whole world lean as 10,000 tons of steel swung slowly around beneath you. Day after day, out in the Siberian cold, a handful of people drove the biggest walking machine the world had ever built. Think of what this machine represented, standing out there in the Siberian light. It was the single largest excavator on the face of the planet, a one-off, the only one of its kind ever built. It was, in steel and cable, exactly what the Soviet planners had dreamed of. Proof that their system could build bigger than anyone, anywhere. The living symbol of Soviet industrial might. And for 15 years, it never let them down. It did not break in half. It did not topple. It did not fail. Through Siberian winters and Siberian summers, through the daily punishment of lifting and swinging and stepping, the great machine simply kept working. It was, by any honest measure, a triumph. Which is what makes what happened next so hard to tell. Because the giant of Nazarovo was never defeated by the cold, or by the work, or by the years. It was not brought down by anything an engineer could have foreseen or fixed. It was brought down by the collapse of an entire world. The machine wired into the body of the Soviet Union was about to learn what happens when that body dies. Chapter 6. Copper and Rust. In 1991, the Soviet Union came apart. And with it went the world that had given the walking giant a reason to exist. The centrally planned economy, the endless demand for cheap coal, the flow of money into vast Siberian mines, all of it faltered, and much of it stopped. The Nazarovo field wound down, the investment dried up. And out at the edge of the pit, the largest excavator on Earth fell silent. In the early 1990s, the machine was mothballed, switched off, its great arm still, its bucket resting on the ground. The grid that had fed it, the country that had built it, no longer had any use for it, or any money to keep it. It stood there, enormous and idle, in the Siberian silence. And that is when the second death began. A machine that big, standing abandoned and unguarded, is not just a monument. It is a fortune in raw metal. And the single most valuable thing on it is the copper. Kilometers of thick copper cable wound through the giant's body like veins. In the hard, hungry years after the collapse, that copper was worth real money to anyone willing to take it. So they came, and they stripped it. Piece by piece, the wiring was cut out of the machine and carried away for scrap. And here is the detail that says everything about what had happened to this country. Nobody stopped them. There was no one left to stop them. The mine, the ministry, the state that had built this giant and wired it into the grid, all of it had dissolved. The largest excavator ever built no longer belonged to anyone at all. Gutted of its copper, stripped of anything worth carrying off, the giant was finally cut apart for scrap. By the end of the decade, the walking colossus of Nazarovo, the one-off, the only one of its kind, the pride of Soviet gigantism, was gone. Torch by torch, section by section, fed into the furnaces to become something else. Nothing of the real machine survives. No giant sits preserved in a park. No hall was built around it. The only thing left is a small-scale model, standing quietly in a museum at the Uralmash works, where it was born. A toy-sized ghost of the largest excavator the world has ever seen. And nothing that size has ever walked again. But before we leave the giant in the snow, there is one more thing worth knowing. Because the Soviet Union was not the only empire that built a walking monster like this, and then watched it die. On the other side of the Cold War, in the coalfields of Ohio, the Americans had built their own colossus. They called it Big Muskie. It was a walking dragline too, every bit as vast, heavier even, though the Soviet giant reached further with its 100-metre arm. And each superpower, in its way, had watched the other's machine. Washington had been tracking Soviet walking excavators from the very beginning. There are declassified intelligence reports on exactly these machines, filed away decades ago. Two rival empires, each building the biggest digging machine on Earth, each keeping an eye on the other's giant. And here is the part that turns two stories into one. Big Muskie died at almost exactly the same time as the giant of Nazarovo. It was shut down at the start of the 1990s and cut up for scrap by the end of that decade, just like its Soviet twin, but the reasons were mirror images of each other. The Soviet giant died because communism collapsed, because the planned economy that needed it simply ceased to be. Big Muskie died for the opposite reason. It was killed by the market and by clean air laws that turned the world against the cheap, dirty, high-sulfur coal these machines had been built to uncover. One giant was buried by the death of communism, the other by the workings of capitalism. And yet they came to the very same end: torch and scrapyard, and a single bucket left behind as a monument. Because in truth, neither machine was really killed by its own system. They were both killed by the same thing. The age of the giant open-pit coal machine was simply ending, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, at the same moment in history. And these two vast, walking cathedrals of steel were the last of their kind. The walking giant of Nazarovo never failed. It did everything its makers asked of it for 15 years, without complaint. It was not beaten by an enemy, or by the cold, or by any flaw in its 10,000 tons of steel. It simply outlived the country that gave it meaning by about 2 years, and then stood alone in the snow, waiting for the men who came to cut out its copper heart. On this channel, we walk through a whole graveyard of these machines, Soviet giants that were bold and doomed and left to rust. The walking colossus of Nazarovo is one of the strangest of them all. If you want to meet another, there is a link on the screen, and I think you'll want to see it. I'm Iron Curtain Industries.